First, I want to congratulate all the students who got an award, got a certificate, and hopefully there's some money that's associated with that, at least someplace. If there isn't, go see your administrators, and I'm sure they have extra money they can give you there. So there, now that I've made myself popular with the leadership of the college. Yeah, so I'm basically, all you need to know about me is, yes, I ended up in the Navy for about 32 years, and I'm really a recovering weather forecaster. So I kind of come at this from a pretty much practical viewpoint, and climate got added as the Navy started looking further and further ahead. I think at one point I was supposed to talk about science. I'll be happy to do that in Q&A, because, spoiler alert, this is not really about science. This is not a science issue. The science is cutting-edge 19th century science. We know it really, really, really well, kind of like we know gravity. It's sort of that way. You don't see people saying, I don't think I believe in gravity, so let me step off a 6-story building and see what happens. We don't see that. So we know the science. Now, if anybody, again, has questions in Q&A, I'm happy to talk about that. But what I think I'd prefer to spend a few minutes talking about is maybe some things that maybe not everybody's heard, like, why did the Navy get so involved in this so early on? And what should we do? So really what happened was back in 2007, when probably most of the undergraduates were in elementary school, the Arctic experienced really the first collapse of ice. And what that did was that generated a lot of conversation to the head of the Navy, we call the Chief of Naval Operations, on what we should do, all the way from nothing to, oh my God, this is a huge thing, to everything in between. So what do you do if you're running a really large organization and you have this problem that people keep bugging you with, that you're not quite sure what to do and it's taken up a lot of time? You find somebody else to put the dot on their forehead. And that was me. Now, what really helps in the Navy is it's a hierarchical organization. What does that mean? That means if your boss is interested, you are
fascinated.
Fascinated, exactly. So the head of the organization is now interested. So it becomes pretty easy to start moving this. The corollary to that is leadership counts. I would not be on this stage if it wasn't for Admiral Gary Ruffhead, who was the head of the Navy at the time, who said, hey, we need to look at this. So basically, Admiral Ruffhead asked me what we should do, and the bottom line was we need to concentrate on the Arctic, but the Arctic is just really a harbinger. It's a leading indicator of many, many changes to come that our Navy and our defense forces are going to have to deal with. And that's why Admiral Ruffhead accepted the recommendation that we stand up a task force on climate change, Navy Task Force on Climate Change, which we did just over 10 years ago. So that's really how this got started. It was because we saw a change in the environment that happened to be pretty far away from here, but we said, you know, this is going to be an issue. And I told people back then it was not a crisis. Back in 2009, it was a challenge. But if we waited long enough, it would become a crisis. So we're in the waiting game right now. So that's how that works. When I take a look at what climate change means to me in broad terms, in 3 things, 3 words: people, water, and change. This is not a polar bear issue. This is a people issue. It's about you and me. It's about our neighbors. It's about the people in our town, in Norfolk, at our university. It's about the people in our state, people in our country. This is going to affect, either directly or indirectly, every single person here and every child and every child at least that you have. This issue is not going to go away anytime soon, and we are going to manage it one way or the other, or it will manage us. It's about water. It's about having too much or too little, wrong place, wrong time, salty where it should be fresh, wet where it should be dry, liquid where it should be solid. The very chemistry of the oceans, as many of you are studying here, are changing. That impacts food webs, which in turn impact how we feed billions of people on this planet. And then finally, it's change. I mean, I come from Pennsylvania, from Penn State. You know, it's not like we have ideal climate. We don't see the sun basically between November and March up there. Nobody would claim that's ideal. But what we have had is climate stability. And we've had climate stability really since the dawn of human civilization, and I would argue that is not coincidental. We, in fact, have built human civilization on this implicit premise of climate stability. And now, due to our burning of greenhouse gases, or burning of fossil fuels and the greenhouse gases, we are changing the climate faster than we have ever seen happen on this earth. So how are we going to deal with that with 7 going to 8 going to maybe 9 billion people? That is the change part. It's either going to be a bumpy road or it's going to be a lot worse than a bumpy road. So on the military side, if you're in the Pentagon, if you're talking in the defense establishment, you may hear some of this from Andrew or for some of the other panelists. But again, I really look at things in threes because I can only remember 3 things in threes. First is it changes the operating environment. As the Arctic ice melts out, that means that you're going to need different training, different ships, potentially different types of ways of operating in the Arctic. You're going to need to train for that. You're going to need to think about logistics and bases and all of this. In the United States, as you can all imagine, we are not interested in a fair fight. We want to make sure that not only we know, but our potential adversaries know that we are number one, so don't mess with us. So we want to make sure that if that operating environment has changed, that we send our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into that theater with the very best equipment tuned really for that new environment, not for what might have worked 40 or 50 years ago, but what's going to work. So we need to look at changes in the operating environment. The one, of course, that is near and dear to Norfolk here is threats to our infrastructure, threats to our bases and training ranges. And of course, we have the sea level rise. You're all very aware of that. I just gave a talk at Offutt Air Force Base a couple of weeks ago. They had a over $1 billion freshwater flood there. So while we think about the coast, these issues of threats, either from floods, droughts, fires, are certainly not just the coast. Because if we don't have our bases, we can't be ready for that potential fight. And then finally, we look at the geostrategic impacts. And again, I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. It is not as simple as something in climate happens, therefore a country falls apart. It is a much more complex issue than that. But if you think of sort of a link of a chain of events or dominoes, if you will, that's a little simplistic, but it kind of gets the point across that climate change can be one of the contributors, and if you could take that out, you may have much, much less of a problem than if it stays there. So what I tell people is climate change can make a bad situation worse, and sometimes catastrophically so. So those are the 3 ways in which climate impacts security here. No, I'm not playing with my phone here, but if you sit up on this stage, and some of you guys will get to do this at some point in your career, there's no clock. Which means I could talk for about 3 hours, but I'll try not to do that. So I've got about another 90 seconds here. So I said, okay, this is not about science. What is this about? It's about messages and messengers. It's about trust and tribes. It's about values. When we talk to people who, for whatever reason, don't really want to get on board the train of fixing this, it's probably because we're really rubbing hard against somebody's values. So I get a lot of people who want to, quote, debate me on the science. And pretty quickly, you get to say, it's always a guy, right? So you get to say, look, you're not Einstein, you're not Galileo, you're not Newton, you're some dude living in your mom's garage, usually. So what is it that scares you so much about this? Because other things don't seem to scare you. Probably things that should scare you aren't scaring you, like those 3 packs of cigarettes a day you're smoking. So what is it? And it's either, I don't want to be regulated by the government, I'm afraid you're going to make energy really expensive and I can't do the things I either have to do or like to do, or my job's going to go away. And then it's like, okay, now we can talk about that. But don't pretend that this is a science argument, okay? So let's actually figure out what common ground we can have on these and how do we move forward together. So I'm going to pretty much stop at that part. I am really, really happy to see everybody here, because I'll tell you, and Andrew can certainly comment on this, that in my view, the Congress is not going to lead us out of this, but they can be led. And you know who's going to lead them? The voters. And if you guys and gals vote, you are then part of the solution. So that bottom-up approach, ultimately, hopefully with some fairly smart things coming top-down, but really the bottom-up approach ultimately is going to drive this. We have seen rapid change in our country before on issues we thought were intractable. It can happen again. I think it will happen again. And it's going to be driven by you guys. Because I'll just tell you one last thing. The ICE does not care who is in the White House. It does not care whether a Republican controls the Senate or a Democrat controls the House. It just melts. And it's going to keep melting until we do something about it. And that something is going to come from the next generation. And that's why I'm so happy you guys are here. Thank you very much.